Now, speaking of Russia, Moscow has made a power move on the other side of the world. Yesterday, some Russian ships arrived in Cuba. Russian warships. There was one guided missile frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov. It's the lead ship of an entire class of frigates, armed with Caliber cruise missiles, Zircon hypersonic missiles, and Onyx anti-ship missiles. It arrived in the Havana port yesterday, flanked by a tugboat and a fuel ship. So a Russian frigate, armed to the teeth, docked in Cuba, a country that the US has embargoed since 1958. You heard that right, 1958, 66 years. It is the longest trade embargo in modern history. So it's safe to say that Cuba and the US aren't on good terms, and now a Russian ship has docked in Havana. It's a signal from Putin that Russia can waltz into America's backyard anytime it wants to. And the frigate wasn't even the real message. Putin's big warning cruised in a little later, half submerged, Cuban and Russian naval flags fluttering in the wind, and a contingent of soldiers on the deck. It was a Russian nuclear-powered submarine, the Kazan. Cuba greeted the vessel with a cannon salute. The residents of Havana had lined up to get a glimpse of the ships, especially the submarine.
I saw it, a submarine, and I said, wow. And I took a picture. I have never seen a submarine in Havana in my life.
It impresses me a little because I have never seen something so close, such a large ship of that magnitude.
The Cubans were clearly impressed. But Putin isn't doing this to capture their attention. His target is a little to the north. Barely 160 kilometers away from Cuba, that is where Florida begins, which means that Putin has just sent his warships to America's doorstep. This comes weeks after an American provocation. The US recently gave Ukraine a green light. It allowed Kiev to use American weapons to strike Russian territory. Putin said that it was an escalation, and now he has responded by sending warships to Cuba. This has some Americans worried.
Hopefully this is not the beginning of something that could be unpleasant for humanity, because we are the ones in the middle. We are the ones who pay the highest price for the conflicts and disagreements that one group has with the other group, and in the end they stay safe, because they send war, and we are the ones who pay a high price.
Washington is trying to downplay this incident. They say this keeps happening, that Russia keeps sending ships to Cuba, which is partly true. But while Russian ships do keep going to Cuba, Moscow hasn't sent a submarine before. And this time, there's a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable Russian submarine in Cuba. Washington says the submarine is not carrying nukes. Cuba was also quick to clarify this, which is to be expected, because this country has been in this situation before, at the frontier of a war between Washington and Moscow. I'm talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back in 1962, Cuba was the site of a showdown between the Soviet Union and the US. The previous year, in 1961, the US had placed nuclear weapons in Italy and Turkey. It was a provocation, so the Soviet Union retaliated by preparing to place nukes in Cuba. In 1962, US spy planes captured the preparations. Washington could not have that, but they could not attack either. Instead, they decided to blockade Cuba. The Americans sent out their warships, but the Soviets blocked their path. So Soviet and American vessels were face to face, and the world was minutes away from an all-out nuclear war. Eventually, both sides backed off. That, in a nutshell, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba was about to be the flashpoint for a nuclear war. So this country has a symbolic importance, and now Putin has sent his warships to Havana again, including a nuclear-capable submarine, which is a loud warning to the US. Russia is telling them that its patience is running out. But will the US listen, or will it continue to egg Ukraine on? Fan of Italy's famous cuisine? Well, we are serving it with a side of diplomacy. As the G7 leaders gather in southern Italy, Vantage is taking you to the heart of the action. What's the agenda? Who is invited? And how is Italy preparing for it? Catch the special edition of Vantage throughout this week, only on Firstpost. Fan of Italy's famous cuisine? Well, we are serving it with a side of diplomacy. As G7 leaders gather in southern Italy, Vantage is taking you to the heart of the action. What's the agenda? Who's invited? And how is Italy preparing for it? Catch the special edition of Vantage throughout this week, only on Firstpost.